He had a sheet draped over him, and it had a large quantity of blood on it. And I said to him, "Oh my God," and he said that he had killed my parents.
Jens Söring, do you have any reason to say or cause to offer why this court should not now pronounce judgment in your two cases?
I'm innocent.
The year is 1985. A brutal double murder rocks the small town of Lynchburg, Virginia. The victims are a wealthy couple named Nancy and Derek Haysom. Months later, their 21-year-old daughter, Elizabeth Haysom, and her 19-year-old boyfriend, Jens Söring, a German student and a son of a diplomat, will become the targets of the investigation. Upon his arrest, Söring confesses to the murders. 4 years later, during his trial, he recants his confession and claims that he only took the blame to save Elizabeth Haysom, whom Söring claims is the real killer, from the death penalty. In 1990, Jens Söring is found guilty of the murders of Nancy and Derek Haysom by a U.S. jury and is handed down 2 life sentences. Söring is now a convicted double murderer. The trial attracts a great deal of public and media attention in the U.S. and later in Germany. The Söring System, a podcast series from CCC Cinema and Television and Argonne Lab 2022. Please note, this podcast contains graphic descriptions of physical and sexual violence that are not suitable for children. Listener discretion is advised. Episode 1 of 8, The Case. To this day, Jens Söring insists that he is innocent. While he is in prison, he builds up an international network of supporters, whom he refers to in German as his Freundeskreis, or circle of friends. Prominent advocates, including best-selling author John Grisham, actor Martin Sheen, and music industry executive Jason Flom, who has worked with stars such as Katy Perry and Lorde, have all worked to have Söring released. They say that they believe he is innocent. Over the years, Söring has submitted numerous appeals along with applications for parole, habeas corpus petitions, and requests for pardons. All of them have been denied. The authorities were unable to find sufficient grounds to overturn Söring's conviction. That is, until at the age of 53, Jens Söring is paroled and deported to Germany after 33 years in prison. When he arrives at the Frankfurt airport, he is met by a throng of supporters and journalists. Camera teams are on hand to film the event. Söring holds a press conference for the journalists at the airport. German newspapers and television stations such as Die Welt, WDR Aktuell, and Phoenix have posted videos of this moment on their YouTube channels.
Thank you. I'm so happy. I'm so happy. After 33 years, 6 months, and 25 days, I'm so happy to finally be here in Germany. This is so wonderful. I'm so happy. This is the best day of my life.
Jens Söring served a long sentence. Had he been imprisoned in Germany, he could have been released many years ago, even if he had received a life sentence. Now his case could finally be put to rest. He has the right to return to society. And yet Söring remains a figure in the media and continues to tell his story to the public. Since his return to Germany, he has become a popular guest on talk shows and radio programs. He has been interviewed by nearly every major newspaper and magazine in Germany.
This inner strength. More than anything, this ability to survive everything that you've been through these 33 years. Where did you find it?
About what such a long time behind bars can do to a person. Can you see yourself starting over, falling in love again, starting a new relationship? Your first serious relationship ended in disaster, as we have discussed. Now that you're free, can you see yourself as a friend, a life partner, a husband, or a father?
Jens Söring claims to be a victim of the justice system. Based on these interviews, none of these news outlets seem to be questioning his claim of innocence.
They all receive special media packs that not only contain certain case files, but also documents created by Jens Söring himself.
These documents created by Söring are mainly files and paperwork containing information that all seem to prove Söring's innocence.
He's a manipulator. Whenever the facts don't go his way, when they're not in line with his version of the story, then he manipulates people by shifting the focus entirely away from those unfavorable facts, and instead he fully focuses on discrediting the person who is bringing these facts into the public domain.
The podcast, The Söring System, takes a critical look at the case and how it's been received by the German media. Over the years, Jens Söring has created an effective system that has allowed him to keep finding new platforms for his version of events, while at the same time protecting him against critical coverage. This podcast asks questions that Söring has not been publicly confronted with for years.
Well, I think that I'm hoping that the work that you do will go a long way to convince people that certainly that things aren't as Söring says they are, and then they can make their own mind up. But as long as he carries on telling the lies, I'll carry on shooting them down.
I'm here because I want to rectify the mistakes I've made. I want to set the record straight and make people understand what you read is not the actual truth, and you need to be more aware of, what's actually happening.
My personal moral conviction is I'm certain that he did it. And I think he was quite soundly convicted in a very fair trial.
This podcast takes a close look at public court records, expert assessments, witness statements, photos, and news reports in order to offer the public another perspective on the case. We will hear from a variety of people, including police who worked on the case in England and the U.S., and impartial experts who have no personal connection with the case. Jens Söring's story is a controversial and polarizing one. Anyone who expresses a critical opinion automatically becomes Söring's opponent, and that comes with consequences. The opposition. Annabelle. One person who is willing to face the possible consequences of speaking out is Annabelle, a paralegal who currently lives and works in London. We will only be identifying her by her first name in order to protect her family's privacy. She got to know the Söring system from the inside, and on this podcast, she talks openly for the first time about her experiences as a former member of Söring's circle of friends.
So I'm originally from Germany. I've been living in the UK for around 17 years now. I first became part of Söring's circle of friends, the so-called Freundeskreis, after watching the documentary film Killing for Love.
Killing for Love, also known as The Promise, is directed by German director and Grimme Prize winner Markus Vetter and Süddeutsche Zeitung journalist Karen Steinberger. The documentary is released in 2016 and examines Söring's case. It is shown at several international film festivals, in movie theaters, and on television. As a result of the film, many are inspired to join the network of Söring's supporters.
It just seems so incredibly unjust to me. Such a huge miscarriage of justice and a life lost, a human being imprisoned for more than 30 years for a crime he alleges he didn't commit.
Annabelle decides to contact Söring's circle of friends.
So at the time, I never would have imagined that only 3 months later, I would end up having the court documents on my desk. Over time, I was so deeply involved in the case that for a long time, Jens Söring himself referred to me as his second most important supporter. So when he returned to Germany at the end of 2019, I traveled to Hamburg to meet him, and I was still part of the team until I was kicked out.
Annabelle is the first person from Söring's inner circle to speak openly about her experiences with him and the circle of friends. This is a decision that requires a great deal of courage in the eyes of her former fellow campaigners and also for Söring himself, whose freedom Annabelle fought for many years. She is a traitor. This is another reason why she does not want to have her full name to be used on this podcast.
I am afraid of him, and this is something that I've said to Terry as well, because Jens Söring is somewhat unpredictable. And I ended up in a situation where I revealed far too much about myself, so I am afraid of him. Yeah.
Terry Wright. Terry Wright is a retired Scotland Yard detective. He is also the author of a 454-page report in which he exhaustively analyzes Söring's claims of innocence. Wright catches the attention of Söring and his circle of friends after submitting his report to the governor of Virginia and later posting it online. According to Söring's network, Wright's criticism is unfounded, and furthermore, they question whether or not Terry Wright even wrote the report himself.
My name's Terry Wright. I'm a retired Metropolitan Police officer. I joined the Metropolitan Police in 1982 and I retired in 2015. Back in 1986, I was one of the officers involved in the case of Jens Söring and Elizabeth Haysom. I'm the author of the report that was submitted to the Governor of Virginia and later released on the internet, and it's known as the Wright Report.
Terry Wright worked for the London Metropolitan Police for more than 30 years. Over the course of his career, he also worked together with other organizations including the FBI, the UK National Criminal Intelligence Service, NCIS, and the United Nations Mission in Kosovo, UNMIK. In 1986, he is one of the first officers to question Elizabeth Haysom and Jens Söring after their arrest in London. The case has haunted him to this day.
Over the last 2 years, I was very busy writing a report about the Jens Söring case. I'd heard that there was new DNA evidence that showed that he was innocent, and I was concerned that if he was innocent, that he shouldn't be in prison, and I would be one of the first to try and get him released. So I started to look again at all the old evidence, that the copies that I had, and I expected to be writing a letter, probably 20 or 30 pages long. It later turned into a report, over 400 pages, which I then submitted to the Governor of Virginia.
For Terry Wright, it's about finding out the truth. The goal of his report, which he spent several months compiling and which he had his former Scotland Yard partner, Kenneth Beaver, review, is to get to the bottom of things. Andrew Hamill. Andrew Hamill, an American lawyer, former law professor, and author living in Düsseldorf, has also discovered what it means to come up against Jens Söring and his team.
My name is Andrew Hamill, and I've lived in Germany for about 20 years now and quite enjoy it here. I'm no longer actively licensed to practice law because I've moved on from being a lawyer. I was also a law professor at the University of Düsseldorf for about 10 years, an associate professor. But then I just decided to leave academia. And so I have law degrees from the University of Houston and Harvard Law School. And I publish in English and in German on various themes, usually about the law and criminal justice and constitutional law and public policy and things like that.
Andrew Hamill has followed the Söring case for a long time. After all, in America, the Haysom murders were national news.
So the case in general was always on my radar screen from even before I went to law school. When I came to Germany and began teaching at a German university, many students, they were aware of my background as a criminal defense lawyer, and they asked me about Jens Söring because he was, a minor celebrity in Germany. But I only became really interested in the case in 2019 after hearing about it for years and years. And I watched the film Killing for Love, and the film struck me as, raising more questions than it answered. And I thought to myself, all right, let me just see whether there's really anything to his innocence story.
Andrew Hamill explains what has drawn him to the case.
Well, I guess I'm a person who likes a good debunking. And now I realize that basically millions of Germans and Americans believe conspiracy theories about the case of Jens Söring. And I thought I could do something to basically clear away the conspiracy nonsense and get back to the real truth that he genuinely did kill the Haysoms.
Hamill privately follows the case over the years until December 2019, when the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung publishes a long-form article on the Söring case that Hamill has researched and written. This article makes him the face of the anti-Söring faction practically overnight, a role that he has since resigned himself to, one that he has taken on and is willing to play, and one that has made him popular in some circles and notorious in others. Since the article was published, he has continued to follow the case, has published additional articles about the case in the FAZ, on his blog, and on other platforms, and sees himself as a counterweight and corrective to the standard Söring narrative. The beginning. The case begins with a meeting that, in hindsight, would be a fatal one. In 1984, 18-year-old Jens Söring meets 20-year-old Elizabeth Haysom during their freshman year at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. Both had received prestigious merit-based scholarships. They soon fall in love and begin what would ultimately become a toxic relationship, one that would be characterized by fear of abandonment, inferiority complexes, and violent fantasies. The murder. On March 30th, 1985, a brutal double murder occurs in a suburb of Lynchburg, Virginia. Elizabeth Haysom's parents, Nancy and Derek Haysom, are a couple that is well known in the area and who live in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. After a friend of the family tries unsuccessfully for several days to reach Nancy and Derek Haysom, she drives to their home in Lynchburg, Bedford County, which Nancy has named Loose Chippings. She has a spare key. The scene that greets her there is horrific. Nancy Haysom, 53-year-old, is found in the kitchen wearing a robe. Her 72-year-old husband, Derek, is lying on the threshold between the living room and the dining room. Their throats have been cut so severely that they are both practically beheaded.
She's wearing a blue floral type housecoat, and it is quite shocking for anybody that's not used to seeing photographs like that. But actually, there's another photograph which is even worse. After they've done the initial photographs, they've rolled Nancy over, and you can see the extent of her injuries to her throat, and they are horrendous and very shocking.
Terry Wright holds the crime scene photos in his hands. He has brought them with him from London, along with a pile of papers, documents, copies, and transcripts that he has compiled over the past decades.
There were also some other photographs of Derek Haysom where the photographer has obviously taken the photographs around the body, and then to demonstrate the extent of his wounds, they've pulled his shirt up to expose his back. And you can see multiple stab wounds and blood all over his back. Some of the stab wounds have obviously been made by a knife that's gone straight in, even though I'm not a forensic scientist, I can see that. And others, the wounds are actually quite long, where I presume the knife's gone in and then it's been ripped downwards. And again, quite shocking, but nowhere near as shocking as the actual photograph that shows the injuries to Derek's face and throat. and they are really, really awful, and probably the worst injuries I've ever seen throughout my service. And I know that most of the American officers have said exactly that they'd never seen injuries like it. It's so bad that these photographs haven't really been circulated anywhere. The Virginia authorities never put them out for the public to see, because obviously that would be very upsetting to friends and family, and actually probably upsetting to any member of the public that's just looking at them. But you can see that Derek's throat was cut from his chin right down his jawbone, right to the back of his neck, down both sides, and then right down to his breastbone. And it's basically his whole throat is just wide open, to the extent that it's open maybe, well, it's from his breastbone to the bottom of his chin, and it's only the back of the neck that's actually holding his head on. He has some horrendous slashes across his face, and it looks to me, and again this is just my opinion, but it looks to me as though whoever did it was in some kind of a frenzy.
The investigators who arrived on the scene will later describe the events as a slaughterhouse. In their opinions, this was clearly a case of overkill, a term that's used in the field of criminal law to describe when an attacker inflicts injuries that greatly exceed what is necessary to kill the victim. The investigation. In Bedford County, detectives Ricky Gardner and Chuck Reed are entrusted with the case. They pursue a number of different leads. Evidence is collected at the scene of the crime, including a bloody sock print and blood samples. For the investigators, one thing is clear. The Haysoms must have known their murderer or murderers. On a video call, Ricky Gardner, the now retired criminal investigator, recalls the start of the investigation.
The investigation revealed early that there was no forced entry into the residence. And secondly, it didn't appear to be a robbery because there was jewelry and money found in the residence. So right off the bat, the investigation showed that whoever killed the Haysoms, most likely they knew, because they invited them into the house. It wasn't a forced entry, as I said. And then the motive obviously wasn't robbery.
Initially, the Haysoms' friends and family are questioned and are eliminated as suspects through alibis, plausible statements, and discrepancies with the evidence collected at the scene. In September 1985, less than 5.5 months after the crime, Jens Söring and Elizabeth Haysom become the target of the investigation. Both are summoned individually to the local police station for questioning. Elizabeth Haysom is cooperative and friendly. She does not hesitate at the time or later on in the investigation to give the police samples of her hair, blood, fingerprints, and footprints for comparison. Her alibi. On the weekend in question, she was in Washington, D.C. with her boyfriend, Jens Söring.
We asked her where she was that weekend, and that's when she told us that she and her boyfriend, Jens Söring, had rented a car in Washington that weekend on that Friday evening after they got out of class, and that they drove to Washington, stayed at the Washington Marriott, and then spent the day sightseeing or whatever and seen some movies.
But the mileage on the rental car tells a different story. The odometer shows too many miles for a trip from Charlottesville to Washington, D.C. It is, however, enough to include a detour from Washington to Lynchburg.
Confronted her about the mileage on the rental car, and she stated that they had traveled around the D.C. area, and that to and from they had gotten lost a couple of different times throughout their travels, and that was her explanation for the unexplained miles on the rental car.
The investigators remain skeptical. The car is searched for trace amounts of blood with luminol, a substance that causes a light-producing chemical reaction when it comes into contact with substances or chemicals that contain iron. But no blood is found. According to Terry Wright, there could be a number of reasons for this.
That doesn't mean to say there was no blood there. It just means they didn't find any. So you don't know how well the car was actually examined. And I think basically a few swabs were taken in a few places, and that was it. There's no real in-depth examination of that car. The car had also been returned to the rental company, and the first thing they do when a customer brings the car back is clean it. I don't know how many times it had been rented out in between them taking it back and the police examining the car. I don't know whether or not the car was examined in broad daylight, where there could have been a reaction that was never seen because of the daylight.
This means that, according to Terry Wright, we cannot say for certain whether or not there was any blood in the car based on the luminol testing. Ricky Gardner recalls.
We didn't find the blood in the car. And throughout this whole period of time, of course, we was interested in talking to Söring, but he wouldn't make himself available for any interviews. So he wouldn't respond to my phone calls or requests for any kind of an interview.
At some point, however, Söring changes his mind and says he is willing to come in for questioning.
And I believe that date was October the 6th. It was a Sunday afternoon, and he agreed to come to Bedford County. Chuck Reed and I interviewed him at the sheriff's office. We audio taped the interview. And at that particular time is when he was very arrogant and, basically told us that he couldn't understand why we would ever suspect him of murder these people, that he wasn't capable of doing that. So, we asked him, okay, Elizabeth's given us her blood and her foot impressions, anatomical foot impressions and fingerprints. How about you giving us yours? And he said, no, he said, I can't do that.
In March 2012, Jens Söring's book, Nicht schuldig, Not Guilty, is published in German by Drummer Knur. In it, Söring tells his life story and shares his view on the case. Among other things, he describes how, after being questioned by the two investigators in Bedford County in October 1985, one thing was clear. He and Elizabeth had to leave the country as quickly as possible. Söring drives back to his apartment and tries to remove all of his fingerprints there. According to Söring and Haysom's diary entries, which are later seized and used in court, Söring is worried that he may have left fingerprints on a coffee cup at the police station in Bedford County. But if he hadn't been present at the scene of the crime, why would he be so worried about his fingerprints?
That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And the reason it doesn't make sense is because he was travelling on his own passport. And in those days, fingerprints weren't electronic, so nobody could trace him from his fingerprints as he travelled around Europe, but they would trace him from his passport.
The getaway.
When Haysom and Söring ran away from America, it was quite a hasty departure. They closed their bank accounts, withdrew as much money as they could, bought their tickets, and they actually travelled separately. Söring went first.
On October 12th, 1985, Jens Söring flies from Washington, D.C. to Brussels. From there, he takes a train to Paris.
That's a point that perhaps might be of interest to you, because Elizabeth Haysom followed the next day, whereas if she really wanted him to take the blame for the murder, she could have actually stayed there and then just said, Jens did it and that's why he's run away. But she didn't. She went with him because at the time she felt that she loved him and that she had been a big part of the reason why her parents were dead.
During her trial in 1987, Elizabeth Haysom even testifies that she wanted to remain in the U.S., but Söring had blackmailed her, that he had taken compromising letters with him to Europe and threatened to send the letters to the police if she didn't follow him. A few days later, Haysom flies to Europe. In Virginia, the investigations come to a halt. Retired police officer Ricky Gardner.
We didn't have enough evidence to arrest them. Once you arrest somebody, and you've only got one chance of a bite at the apple, if you will, and if you don't have your ducks in a row and all your evidence lined up, and you go to trial and you can't prove the case and they're found not guilty, then you can't retry him. His car was found at a airport a couple of days later. So we, at that particular time, we surmised that they probably had left the country. You know, we were sort of dead in the water at that particular time because we didn't know where they were. where they went. We didn't know anything.
The scam. Jens Söring and Elizabeth Haysom spend the following months traveling across Europe and Southeast Asia. They finance their expensive itinerary and lifestyle with different scams. They record their experiences in a sort of shared diary. They take turns writing letters and notes in a notebook that they use to document their trip.
They had various schemes, and they recorded them in the diary. One of them was they actually stole some collection boxes. And I say stole, they might have actually gone to the charity office and actually picked up some boxes, but they were trying to collect money on the streets until they were stopped by a local police officer, and they thought that was a bad idea then, because they got away with it once, because the police officer just believed them, and they thought we better not do that again in case we get stopped again.
In February 1986, Jens Söring and Elizabeth Haysom arrive in England, where they shuttle back and forth between Bath and London. Amidst the hustle and bustle of the city, they try out increasingly brazen strategies for acquiring money through various kinds of check fraud.
They deposited cash of their own into the bank accounts to open them. Once they had the checkbooks, they would come to London. They would spend the whole checkbook over the period of a weekend, and they would spend them specifically in Marks and Spencer's store. If you decided you didn't like an item, they would just accept it back and give you your money back. So that was a way of changing the check into cash. Okay, so buy it with a check and then do the exchange, and you've now got the cash. And then on the Monday, they would go back to their bank and say, we were in London at the weekend and somebody stole our checkbook. And they've used, and of course the bank would then find out that the whole checkbook had been used. So the money that had been spent using the checks would then get reimbursed to their account.
A clever system that works seamlessly for Söring and Haysom, at least at first.
He planned everything out meticulously, and of course it all went wrong, which is, what normally happens with his plans.
To save time and acquire greater sums of money more quickly, Söring makes a small adjustment to his plan. This time, they will both go shopping at the same Marks and Spencer at the same time.
And what they were doing was, Söring was walking around the store buying ladies' clothes, and Haysom was walking around the store buying men's clothes. And they walked around separately, and they even passed each other and didn't even acknowledge each other. And Sefton, the store detective, saw them do a refund, saw them do a check purchase.
Although there is no reason to stop them, the store detective decides to follow Söring and Haysom.
She just thought they looked strange. It just wasn't normal behaviour. So she followed them around as best she could inside the store, and then she followed them outside. And when they went outside, they met up and began to talk to each other. So that is unusual behaviour, isn't it? Totally ignore each other inside the store, meet up outside, and she was suspicious. Yeah, she followed them along the main high street in Richmond, which is not a very big suburb, but she followed them along the road and actually bumped into an off-duty police officer that she knew, and told him what she'd seen. So he began to follow them as well. But he was off duty and he didn't want to follow them all the way into London and spend the whole day when he's supposed to be on his day off. So they followed them and onto a train, an underground train, and they went to the next stop. And at that next stop, they stopped the train and got them off the train, and then asked them what about their behaviour. And of course, that led to their arrest.
The arrest. At the police station in the London neighbourhood of Richmond, Jens Söring and Elizabeth Haysom meet the detectives Kenneth Beaver and Terry Wright.
When they got arrested for the fraud, both of them were very polite. We were polite to them, of course. Of course, they were trying to convince us that they were just two students from Canada. In fact, he was meant to be a student and she was meant to be a writer.
Söring and Haysom claimed to be Christopher Platt and Tara Lucy Noe, a married couple from Canada. These are the names on their IDs.
They had their ID cards, and although they were false, we had nothing to compare them with. We'd never seen a Canadian driving licence or an ID card, so We didn't know whether they were genuine or not.
The names are also on their bank paperwork and checkbooks.
And obviously that's the same name on the checkbooks. So they were saying that everything was legitimate. It's their bank accounts, their signatures, albeit not saying Jan Söring, their signatures said Christopher No.
Söring and Haysom do their best to act as inconspicuous as possible. But it isn't enough for Wright and his colleagues. Since the pair only have their Canadian ID cards on them, Wright asks for their passports.
When they said they were Canadian citizens, I said, well, where's your passport then? And they were staying in an address, I think it was in Bath. There's a small town in the UK called Bath. And I said that I would get the local police to go around and search that house. So I think that put him in a difficult position. He either told us where the passport and where they were living in London for that weekend, or we would go around and disrupt the family that they were lodging with. So in the end, I think he decided he would tell us where the apartment was in London, and that was a big mistake, I think.
Without realizing it, Jan Söring has played right into the detectives' hands.
We can actually, if somebody's in custody for an arrestable offence, the police have the power to search any premises that they have control of. So obviously our next step was to take him with us and go and search the premises. Actually, when we got there, the first thing I saw on the bed was a load of wigs and hats and basically theatrical disguises. And I immediately realised that all the time we'd been speaking to him, Söring's moustache was false. He'd been wearing this false moustache all the time and nobody had noticed. But it was a very good quality theatrical moustache.
The jig is up. At the hotel room in London, the police make additional discoveries.
So I took that off him and found his passports, and basically there was, I forget the exact amount now, but I do have records of it. There was a couple of £1,000 in cash. There was maybe 28 or 30 bags of Marks and Spencer's property, which amounted to about £1,600 worth of property.
As strange as this collection of objects may appear, the situation seems clear. At this point, Söring and Haysom can no longer claim to be two harmless married students from Canada. Terry Wright.
You could see that it was quite a well-organised criminal enterprise. We took all the property back to the police station, and then we interviewed him the following day, and of course he explained, they both admitted that, what they'd done, and they explained how they went about doing it.
Given the overwhelming evidence, Söring and Haysom admit to committing check fraud. But Wright can tell there's something bigger here. He goes over every detail of Söring and Haysom's belongings. Even if, at this time, Wright has no idea what kind of dark secret Jan Söring and Elizabeth Haysom are hiding, and will soon reveal.
He was sitting most of the time, but he did get up and reenact it, showing how, using gestures with his hands to show how he cut their throats, and how Derek Haysom wouldn't lie down and die.
The Söring System, Episode 1 of 8, The Case. Our narrator is Karen Cifarelli. You also heard the voice talents of Michelle Glick, Sungur Ben-Turk, and Seamus Sargent. This has been a production of Argonne Lab and CCC Cinema and Television 2022.